Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks for having me here from Santa Barbara. This is kind of part of my master's thesis work. It's not fully finished, but I'd be glad to hear your feedback on what it is. This work I'll be presenting about some analysis on some tweets I did, and the project kind of started because I had a friend involved. She's interested in studying Colombian politics, and I kind of followed her to Colombia for a couple of months and I just listened to her do like 20 interviews and learned about how to plan interview guides and stuff. But this is just about the tweets. I'm in my third year at UC Santa Barbara. So today what we're going to look at is we're going to look at a particular political party. And so I'm from Sociology of Culture. That's kind of the theoretical framework that I'm going to be using here. And interested in studying political parties. There are a lot of studies that focus on how parties form in relation to one another, or how they form like coalition building or strategy and that kind of thing. And in particular, in this study, I'm kind of interested in influence between members and their relationships to one another simply through discourse. And I think sociology of culture is well equipped to study that. How what one politician says is taken up by other politicians. And I think we saw a great presentation on that yesterday, and this is Colombia instead of France, I guess. So the question that I'm looking at is, when are politicians influential? And I kind of divide it all sort of into two categories. One is this sort of when using fringe discourse. In the US, we have characters like Steve Bannon who, when they talk about the world, they sort of say some things that a lot of people are like, what? But then, a couple months later, you see this sort of becoming mainstream in the Republican Party. And a lot of folks have written about this, about, opinions towards Islam and other things like that. And I'm just kind of calling this sort of politicians are influential when using fringe discourse. But the thing that I'm kind of questioning is like, what makes it fringe? Is it, and I'll go over that. And then the other one is sort of mainstream effects, which is pretty unsurprising. It's sort of like, what are the role of party leaders who are already kind of talking, have been articulating kind of the same thing? How can we measure that influence as well? That's sort of like making more subtle shifts between party members, in this case, tweets. And to sort of do that, I'm gonna operationalize this notion of the discursive field. So it's sort of been taken up, kind of, I think, transition from originally being sort of the space of possible discourses with which actors might use, and now is kind of, I think, with where you use field theory and sort of American sociology's obsession with it, kind of into trying to situate individuals within it, and how individuals, in this case politicians, distinguish themselves, but also sort of identify with the party through it. Oh, sorry. And I'm going to measure it according to kind of in a similar way that other studies have done it, which, as our previous presenter mentioned, a lot of times done through hand coding, right? What are the dimensions of this discursive field? And my question is so it's not only about, so when I'm asking when are politicians influential, I want to not just study, when certain sort of discourses are taken up, but what are those dimensions along which they can be considered to be using fringe or mainstream messages. And so for my case study, I'm going to be studying this party, Centro Democrático. They're sort of a right wing, okay, maybe that's debatable. They're on the right for sure, a political party in Colombia. They're in opposition to this long-standing peace process there, kind of 50-year war, which has kind of recently culminated in a peace process. And they kind of are probably most famous for they actually got the public to vote against the peace process in 2016 against a specific set of accords, and later they passed it anyway, and the president won a Nobel Prize for it, but it's still under contention because they just won the presidency in July, and so so this is the president of Colombia now, Iván Duque, and so this is going to be, so this presentation is a little bit more methodological, even though for my thesis it's a little bit more substantial. So they've, the party members started creating accounts. So this is the party leader. He founded the party in 2012. But as part of previous political engagements, started kind of mid-2009. Today, I count about 140, 142 party accounts, and I just kind of went through electoral ballots and kind of used what I knew about Colombia to kind of track each of these accounts down. And for my sample, I was able to find about 130 which met a criteria in this time, meaning that they had like some affiliation with the party, they had enough tweets and that kind of thing. And so I just went through each account and kind of downloaded them all. I actually use a tool, but I have 103 accounts, 2015 or 2017, and I ended up about 1 million tweets, which is pretty small. I mean, tweets aren't that much data. Oops, sorry. And it ends up being about 20 to 40,000 tweets a month, and from over the sample period. And the questions that I'm going to be asking again is what, according, along with when are politicians influential, it's are there dimensions under which we observe fringe and mainstream influence? And then if so, what are those dimensions? Because again, we don't want to maybe assume a priori what dimensions that influential politicians distinguish themselves through. And so when I'm talking about this discursive field, I'm sort of conceptualizing this. So we have some field space, and each politician is sort of situated in this space based on what they're saying about the world. So they may be talking about each other, but more likely they're talking about, in Colombia, the conflict, or they're talking about the other political parties, or what the government should be, or what the current government is. But in the way that they talk about these things, they also sort of situate themselves relative to their peers. And in a way, that's sort of like a meaningful relation, a social relation. And what I'm going to be measuring is influence, and I've got a way to measure it, and I can be more specific later. But it's essentially if one politician's tweet one day causes others to sort of tweet more similarly to that in the next day. And I've got this kind of time lag, DV. So a politician is influential in time t if the time t plus 1, other politicians are tweeting similar to that. That's the general idea. So the question is, that's sort of the key question is, what are the dimensions of discourse? So for example, we have 3 topics here. Let's just say, not in the topic sense, the general sense. So immigration, other party, and government ideals. These are things that, the space of things that our politicians talk about, and we want to understand under which dimensions are politicians influential. For instance, if this party leader here talks about immigration when the other party members are talking about another political party or the ideals of what the government should be, and they are influential, then we can say that immigration and these other dimensions matter for influence because they both situate the politician there within the party discursive field, and then but then also sort of shifts them in the next time period to talk more about immigration. Does that make sense? And so again, if this politician is talking about the other party, talking crap about them, and the other party members are talking about immigration or government ideals, and this party member is influential in getting them to talk about the other party instead of these two things, then we can say that other party matters. But if the other party members are talking about immigration or the other party, and this party starts talking about government ideals, but nobody really picks that up, then I would say it's not influential. And maybe if we're talking about influence, in this case from the fringe, right, in terms of differentiating themselves, this is not a meaningful, or this is not important for constructing the discursive field under which we observe this influence. So the issue becomes is sort of I hand selected these, right? But these can always get more complicated, right? So what if we break it down into these subcategories? And so maybe they can talk about immigration in different ways, right? It's like it brings in dangerous people, it brings in drugs, or the other party is the line messed up there, but the other party is dangerous, or the other party is corrupt, or about the government, security, and anti-corruption. But it's even maybe more complicated than that too, because what if it's not actually the claims that they're making or the sort of, what they're saying about these things semantically, but maybe it's like the style of speaking. Maybe it actually has to do, my lines didn't work out. maybe it has to do with actually just talking about things that are dangerous actually is the important dimension here. And it's actually has nothing to do with whether or not they're talking about immigration or government ideals or corruption. So what I want to do is kind of in the same spirit, try to understand which dimensions are important for constructing this field. If I have a measure for constructing the discursive field and I have a measure for influence, then how can I choose a set of these which I know is sort of implicated in this fringe influence or mainstream influence? So again, what are there dimensions under which we observe party influence, and what are those dimensions? So I kind of start out by breaking these dimensions down, just using topic modeling, and it's the only assumption that I make about topic modeling is it creates some kind of useful distinction between topics. So I just take this on the corpus of about 1 million tweets, and it extracts out these latent topics. So here I just showed a word cloud. This is about the plebiscite vote, the one where the public voted against peace. This one's about reparations and like details of the peace implementation. And I take these, and so I generate a set of, let's just say, 100 latent topics. And then I'm representing each tweet here as a topic. So each tweet from a given user in a given, let's just say in a given day, is assigned a distribution. And to understand, and I'm going to break this up by day, try to figure out how each actor in each day situates themselves in the discursive field. And so I take these for the given day, for a given actor, and I average them. And I call this their topic distribution at time t. And this represents like what the user is saying that given day. And I'm going to talk about it in a little bit later, but we're also going to sort of select a subset of those. So a hypothesis about which of these sort of discursive dimensions matter. Maybe it's that level of like, are we talking about the other party or what a government should be? Or maybe it's more like, are we talking about fear or sort of rational arguments, things like that. And then for each day, we take pairwise measures of similarity. So between the old president and the current president, we have their topic distribution from the old president and the topic distribution from the current president. And we're going to compare them simply by comparing the topic distributions. Here I've got a weight measure using just the Jensen-Shannon divergence here. And what I end up with is sort of, this is empirically generated over like a month or something like that, is I can kind of situate each politician in this field, measured through a network, so it's kind of just projected onto 2 dimensions, but you can't really project topic or probability distributions in a Euclidean space. So anyway, so here we've got, and we can try to pinpoint to where each leader is. So this is the party founder, Uribe, kind of towards the mainstream here. We have our ideologues here, so sort of the Steve Bannons, if you will. We got to interview both of these actually, both of these folks. And then we have regular senators. So we actually interviewed both of these folks too, but you see Alfredo Ramos Maya, he's sort of like on the fringe in this case for this time period, using on average more fringe messages. And Paula is using more mainstream messages on average. So it's kind of center. And so we use basic network measures to get an idea of mainstream or fringe as simple network centrality. So for every day, for every politician, we have a centrality measure that measures, are they fringe or mainstream? And it's just simple degree centrality. And now I want to measure influence. And what is influence? Influence is, again, if you're influential, if at time, how am I doing on time? Is it okay? 6 minutes. Okay, I have to go. If at time t, you tweet something, and at time t plus 1, people tend to like follow that tweet in terms of the content, then that's influence. But I had to define it in such a way that they're not both dependent on network at time t and network at time t plus 1, because a Steve Bannon or our ideologues could remain on the fringe while being influential kind of on a day-to-day basis. And you've got to measure for that too. And there are a lot of other reasons that we can measure influence other than just simply positioning yourself in the mainstream or in the periphery, or sorry, in the fringe. Maybe I'm just actually picking up on global shifts, so I can try to control for those in my model. I control for like maybe politicians only follow other people if they get a lot of likes or a lot of retweets. So public reception, effects from outside of Twitter, verified logo, the party says that they're awesome, they're a candidate, they're put as a candidate, or maybe they just tweet a lot and people tend to follow them that way. So I control for all these things. And so now I have a mapping that's I have a statistical model that's sort of trying to predict influence from not only this degree centrality, this mainstream to fringe spectrum, but also all these other things. And what I'm trying to do is find a combination of topics under which we observe a discursive field that we see this influence. And so what we do is we use some like really old algorithms called genetic algorithms, and they sort of, in a way, sort of simulate evolution. They've got these generations and populations. So it just basically works like you randomly select different sets of topics, and then you build the discursive field, and then you measure the influence. And so with a bunch of different combinations of topics, you can sort of evaluate which combinations are better. And it kind of does this iteratively over time. You see, this is a generation. So it started with, in this case, 100 random samples of topics, of the 100 topics. And then it took the best ones and then generated a new population. And then kind of again and again. And all of a sudden, we're converging on sets of topics that construct the discursive field in which we observe this sort of fringe influence. And when we do that, and in the end, this is sort of the model. So because we're sort of treating the independent variable and the dependent variable, we're not answering whether or not being a candidate is actually predictive of influence, but we're basically controlling that because it's not just, it just may be that candidates in the next election tend to be more fringe or something, and maybe it's picking up on that. But what it's saying is that controlling for all these other factors, degree centrality or fringe mainstream is actually predictive of it. And because degree centrality negative is more fringe, then we see negative effects. So fringe politicians are effective in shifting party discourse within this field. And so part of it, I have to admit, I haven't been able to do all the interpretation of the topics yet. This is just sort of like, you have the topics that it's selected, and the job is just to sort of interpret these clusters. I'm not saying that I'm going to do that now. That's sort of what you need to do for substantial claims. But this is kind of this tells me, like, given this model and sort of given this result, it tells me that something about these topics is important. And so maybe they're the sort of groups that I talked about earlier, or maybe not, but this is sort of what I want to do. So I've answered the question of are there dimensions of discourse under which we observe the influence? And then the answer of exactly which dimensions are sort of up to the interpretation. So I don't know if this is a C, C prime, H, or straight to H prime, C, C prime, H prime. Anyway, yeah, and so that's sort of what I'm working on for this sort of substantial thing. And I observed the same thing again for mainstream influence. So we're 2 minutes? Okay, thanks. So what we're observing here is like politicians that are actually using messages that aren't very distinctive still tend to be influential. They sort of push the party even while remaining sort of central. They sort of cause shifts in this discursive field. Oops, sorry. And you can see here we're like converging on some topics, and then of course we observe topics that construct the field under which we observe mainstream influence as well. So the question of is there a discursive field under which my model captures influence from the mainstream? The answer, I would say, yes from this result. And then what are they is sort of, again, up for interpretation. And in this case, it's like a much smaller number of topics. So I need to do more robustness checks to try to understand those. But that's kind of the general idea. So what I'm taking away from this is that, of course, party discourse is partially determined by intra-party influence, as we've seen with other studies. That's not that surprising. And we can also study exactly which dimensions it is that politicians are influential if they distinguish themselves. But then it also suggests that maybe, with this whole coding thing, maybe by pre-selecting coding, if we're trying to look for influence in this, so like, this extreme Bannon kind of messages, maybe the way that we divide up the codes or try to think about the ontology of the messages is sort of predetermining where we see this influencing coming from. And the fact that we have, under different dimensions, we see both fringe and mainstream influence suggests that maybe we should look at these different sort of tensions of that push and pull influence within the party. And finally, maybe with some careful consideration, we can use computational methods to explore this space of possibilities, to search for things that we didn't know exist. So, yeah, anyway, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Maybe we can take a question, if there is one. Otherwise, you can talk to Devin.
Just a quick one about the tweets. So those were tweets that the party were issued, not the whole generation.
That's correct.
So that probably would have more than
If I'm just studying the party, you mean?
Not just the party, but if you're getting all the tweets that are related to political.
Oh.
In Colombia.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and I think that would also give me an idea of between party. That would be the broader and so if I was kind of trying to study how party discourse is shaped by external factors, I think that would definitely be important. And a lot of folks have done network analysis. But yeah, so in this case, I'm just studying the party tweets. Does that make sense? Or did I?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you have any thoughts in terms of the popularity of one party as opposed to the other based on looking only at the party tweets? When you ignore all these other tweeters.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, and not really. I mean, we have the number of tweets and the number of likes and that kind of thing. We have simple measures of user engagement, but I haven't compared across parties. Is that kind of So I haven't. So yeah. So and then maybe in future work, I think that would be interesting to study how parties, of course, develop together, right? Sort of taking stances on issues back and forth. But in this case, I've just been looking at intra-party influence. So, yeah. Thanks.
Thanks again.